There are companies that are now using large language models to help fuel product development. Again, there's a tremendous amount of consumer data out there. You enrich that with customer data. Before you know it, you can have an LLM that's kind of trained, if you will, to be leveraged in kind of a product development, R&D type of environment. So I think the future of product development is algorithm based. The opportunities are endless as it relates to the ways that we can leverage data. But again, with that comes risk. Observability is really important. I think data loss prevention now is really extending. I think all the big providers understand that it has to extend into the browser. One of the things that I think is really critical in building a high-performing team is, sometimes we come into an organization and there's this newness bias, right? And we can overlook talent that is already there, right? So literally right under your nose.
Hi, Chidi. Welcome to Be Fearless podcast. Such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Good morning, Alexandra. Thanks for having me. I look forward to the chat.
Yeah, I'd love to introduce you to our listeners and what we're about to talk here. I think it's always so important to get the background of the person to learn how they look at the world today, and especially the cyber world. So Chidi Alams is CIO at Just Born, which makes the iconic PEEPS, hot tamales, I hope I pronounced it correctly, MIKE and IKE that everyone knows. But your story goes beyond candy. You led digital innovation across Fortune 500 companies, healthcare, financial services, retail, everything you can think of. And now you provide strategic oversight for driving digitalization at Just Born. Super excited for our conversation. I know you had such an incredible journey from financial services, healthcare, and retail to now leading technology in CPG. Can you share the story of how you ended up at Just Born and what drew you to such a different sector?
Sure, I'm happy to. My journey, like most, was, some luck / serendipity, some planning. As much as I love LinkedIn, it's a bit deceptive because when you look at LinkedIn profiles, they read like well thought out journeys. And I think we all know by now that that's rarely the case. So I've been fortunate enough to be in various industries, really all the major industries. And I think the commonality, if you look kind of through my background, is all of the industries and businesses that I've worked for have been very rooted in consumers and customers. So different business models, but consumer customers really the common denominator, which is what drew me to Just Born. I'm a very curious person. Have long been interested in manufacturing in the CPG industry. I wasn't on the market. That's usually how the best jobs materialize. Got the call, spoke with the leadership team, and was just really impressed by how serious they were about their values and how much fun they wanted to have as an organization. And how can you not have fun working for a candy company? So yes, very serious about their values. And those values have really anchored the organization for now over 100 years. But at the same time, they didn't take themselves too seriously. And that element of fun, I think, stood out early in the process. And so now here I am.
Yeah, I think the element of fun is so important wherever you go and whatever you do, just because no matter what role you pick to do, there are always tedious tasks. So it's always good to have the fun aspect of it. Were you specifically choosing between consumer versus enterprise, or it just happened to be that consumer really stood out to you and you felt like it was better fit for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually started my career in high tech. So Expedia, and then I spent some time at Rackspace. But I just find human behavior to be fascinating in many ways. Super fascinating as it relates to consumption and what drives consumer behavior and the different levers that you can use within business to meet the consumer or the customer where they are and provide them a great product and great service. So for me, that's what stands out versus other sectors.
Yeah, and JustBorn is such a unique company. It's been around over 100 years. There are very few companies that can say, hey, I've been around for more than 100 years. How do you balance driving digital innovation and at the same time preserving the heritage of the brand?
It is a wonderful challenge. And let me put that into some context. So we are in the midst of a true transformation. Of course, that term is used quite often. But, if you think about where JustBorn is now, so 100 plus years of operations, third generation family owned. We recently put together our 5-year strategic plan, which is achievable, but very ambitious. And as part of that, to quote Jim Collins, first who, then what, right? So it really starts with talent. So at the top, essentially our entire leadership team is new from the outside. We've brought in new talent in various roles. We've elevated folks who've been with the company for some time as well, which I think is important. And we've kind of recast our values rooted in a number of things. So taking pride in our work, curiosity, standing shoulder to shoulder. And the challenge is, okay, with these new folks coming from the outside, all of us coming from kind of category captain, very large enterprises, a big company, but in many ways, kind of a small family-owned business, right? So on the one hand, the goal is to unlock the potential of the organization because there's tremendous potential in this company. If you look at our brands, I mean, there's a lot of places where we can take our brands potentially even beyond candy, but doing so in a way that is rooted in our values. So that's going to be a challenge. I liken it to, the challenge of growing from a child into an adult, right? So children are imbued with a certain set of values. And while they may change and the expectations of human beings kind of evolve as they go from childhood to adulthood, fundamentally their value systems should remain intact, and they can remain intact. Now, they're expressed differently, right? The values are expressed differently in a child, expressed differently in a teenager, expressed differently yet again in an adult. But you can still grow and evolve and stay anchored in who you are and your values fundamentally. So that's kind of our challenge, and it's something we hold ourselves accountable to every day.
As this transformation is coming along, growing from child into teenager into adult, is there any specific transformation initiative that you're super excited about, or something that just happened and you're really proud or excited about?
There are so many things to be excited about. I really struggled with this one. So the one that I would highlight is an initiative that is a few years in the works. So we're a few phases in, and that's our manufacturing execution system, or MES. So if you think about our supply chain strategy, fundamentally, we make and sell candy, right? So if you distill our business down to the most basic level, one of the things that I found when I joined the organization, which is part of my mandate, is to really get us to be more data-driven. So clearly, we've got to be data-driven in terms of our customers and consumers, but data-driven also applies to our plant floors. So our MES system allows us to really track the performance of our manufacturing equipment and production lines, and several other things. I mean, literally that initiative, if you look at our supply chain strategy, it spans all of the pillars fundamentally, it's about having the right data to manage our production business more in a way that meets demand ultimately. So that's a huge initiative. I mean, if you think about it, most of our employees work in the plant, and that's the one initiative that touches directly or indirectly every employee in our plants. And so it's a lot of big impact, lots of change management. And that's something that's taken a lot of effort to get to where we are today. But I'm extremely proud of the team for the execution on that initiative thus far.
Yeah. And data is indeed such a power nowadays. So whenever it is used or misused, it can bring some very terrible outcomes. And you're a security leader, of course, so many examples in the wild how it can be used and misused. As a security leader, what sort of initiatives do you typically take to combat these risks associated with data?
Yeah, so there are some risks that kind of span industry sectors, right? There are some unique risks in the CPG or manufacturing space. So, we have to protect corporate assets, data, right? So if you think about the crown jewels, you're usually talking about data. But we also have, there are also unique threats related to plant floor. So there's kind of the IT and the OT or operational technology within our plants that we have to secure kind of independently. And then where they meet, we also have to add a layer of security as well. But I think fundamentally, while there are some unique aspects of securing a CPG company from a technology standpoint, I think the lens of risk management remains the same, and we've made that our priority. So we take a fairly disciplined approach, addressing the fundamentals, I'm sure some of which we'll talk about today, but always doing so from the lens of kind of risk management. So again, we make and sell candy, what can prevent us from doing those things? And then as a company that has iconic brands in our portfolio, reputational risk is also something that we're quite mindful of.
Yeah. And from the IT standpoint, what are some risks you think that most other industries don't quite face as you face in the CPG industry?
So third-party risk gets interesting. Especially in a manufacturing context, because, you often have not only third-party connections required to service equipment, but there's a unique physical security aspect, right? When you're having, contractors and maintenance personnel come in periodically to service equipment, that's something that I think you have to keep in mind and address. Not just from a technology standpoint, as you know, it's, there are technical controls, but there are also process controls, and those things have to come together. But I think that those are some of the unique aspects within a manufacturing environment. And then when you think about the production lines themselves, they are connected, they're online. Right. In fact, from going back to the MES or the manufacturing execution platform, that platform is able to pull data from all of those production lines. So those lines that actually produce our candy. So they're online, and they therefore need to be. There's a certain level of security that needs to be applied to each of those connections. So the world of manufacturing is a lot more connected than one might think. And so you've got to be very, very diligent.
Yeah, I saw that you're hiring quite a lot of data engineers at Osborne. What is the goal behind it, and what are you trying to achieve with so many great people joining the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, Alexandra, that's, I wouldn't say surprised me, but I found to be really interesting about the CPG industry is that it's very data rich. There's a tremendous amount of data that's used to, make tactical decisions, from a back office, from a manufacturing, but also make strategic decisions, right, as it relates to our customers. So as a CPG company, our customers are large retailers. So, for example, Walmart. And then our consumers are, of course, all the people, all of our wonderful kind of external stakeholders that consume and enjoy our candy. Of course, we get kind of syndicated POS data through a few platforms, so we can get a better understanding of how we're performing in store. But then I think another area of tremendous opportunity is, again, the consumer space, right? So consumers are, they're constantly putting their activities and what they're eating, why, online via various social channels. So I think that, social media continues to be kind of data rich in terms of understanding consumer behavior. But another space that I'm really interested and excited about as it relates to data, and kind of all of this underpins why we're investing in data talent, is the unique ways that AI is being deployed in the CPG industry. So I'll give you just one example. There are companies that are now using large language models to help fuel product development. Again, there's a tremendous amount of consumer data out there. You enrich that with customer data, and before you know it, you can have an LLM that's kind of trained, if you will, to be leveraged in kind of a product development R&D type of environment. So I think I think the future of product development is algorithm based, and so that's something that I'm tracking very closely. And again, the opportunities are endless as it relates to the ways that we can leverage data. But again, with that comes risk, and we keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, and then on that topic, would you be the one advising to build your own in-house LLM model? Because I'm just thinking from the perspective of, with having over 100 years heritage of such a strong brand, God forbid, things go wrong. But what kind of school of thought are you? Because I don't want to be putting words for you, but what kind of school of thought do you support when it comes to adoption a lot of these technologies from security standpoint?
Yeah, I think it depends. And I know there are folks who have strong opinions about how to leverage and secure AI in the enterprise. But I think it really depends. It depends on your culture. Every company has a unique kind of risk profile. What I might advise a three-letter government agency to do versus retailer, those are likely going to be two different recommendations, right? Or recommendation paths. So generally speaking, I am a big proponent of enablement. So providing secure access to off-the-shelf models. Again, there are certain models that are kind of trained for very specific use cases. And I think leveraging those models, so for example, ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, so these are models that are fairly mature. And so generally speaking, what's encouraging is that the means to secure those platforms are beginning to, I wouldn't say catch up, right? There's still a significant gap, but they're creeping closer and closer and kind of crossing that threshold to where I think we can provide these services in a secure way to our employees. And frankly, I think it's inevitable, right? I think there's a shift happening, and I hear it when I talk with certain security professionals even, that folks are using these tools, right? So I'm very big on observability, and so we've made some investments there. And if you look at the landscape, folks are already using these tools. I think it's inevitable that these tools become just kind of embedded in everyday workflow and everyday life. And so resisting that trend, it's kind of like resisting the use of browsers in the enterprise, right? Browser use is now ubiquitous, right? So I think it's more about how do you securely enable the enterprise. And I think the industry has made some progress there. I also think there are times where it does make sense to create your own models. Certainly go through specific use cases. But again, it really, in that case, it's more about, okay, we've got enough momentum. We have strategic clarity and understanding to know that, hey, we now need to build an internal capability. And that may require investing in additional talent. It may also require, at some point, building your own models. I'm a big believer that you should be strategic and very clear-eyed about the use cases before you go off and build models, when in fact the functionality may already be there available to consume if one just stays curious.
Yeah, it completely makes sense because at the end of the day, creating your own model requires massive investment, massive resource allocation. So when there is something available off the shelf, the question just becomes, how do you use it securely? And then as we live in this hybrid work mode where we have our personal lives interlinked, our work lives, whether we use enterprise version of ChatGPT or our personal version of ChatGPT, with all of these activities, or personal Gmail versus work Gmail, how do we secure all of this, and what has been the impact on your security strategy when it comes to hybrid work?
I'll go back to observability. I think that's really critical. So there's two kind of trends that I'm tracking. So certain vendors just focus on the observability. So what's actually happening within the enterprise in terms of, for example, LLM usage. And there are other companies that kind of provide a layer of capability on top of that to where you can take actions based on, what's happening in the enterprise. So including, everything from blocking to advising users regarding the risk level of their behavior. So I think at a minimum, observability is really important. I think data loss prevention now is really extending. I think all the big providers understand that it has to extend into the browser, right? Because ultimately that's how, whether it's a SaaS application or an LLM, those are generally accessed via browser. And there aren't many really mature enterprise solutions out there that are accessed through a client. I mean, there are some, but most of what folks do day to day, they access through a browser. So from a DLP perspective, I think that's really fundamental. And then again, having, and from my perspective, not just basic observability, but also the ability to take actions that would put the enterprise at risk. I also think that observability is very helpful in terms of understanding the use cases that are going to drive the most impact for the business, right? And so, I'm a big proponent of kind of personas, right, per department, and versus kind of providing blanket access, particularly where you've got to pay for it, right, for some of these tools. I think it does make sense to be a little prescriptive on the front end, working with the business to understand, how specific power users may leverage these tools, and then you can give them access accordingly. But I also think that as folks use the technology, so take AI, for example, they're going to discover use cases that really there's no way you could have even imagined, right, in a vacuum. And so I think the observability gives you more context to define, to kind of marry the prescriptive approach with, what's actually happening, what folks are actually using these tools for to make their day-to-day easier. And then you can kind of get a better understanding of productivity, ROI, et cetera.
Mhm. I'm just curious from the observability standpoint. What kind of unexpected threats that you think enterprises start to notice once they get this exposure? Because I think so many threats today, as you rightfully mentioned, they are so underestimated. You don't even know that it exists, and then it's just comes as a big surprise at the end of the day. So let's say if there were one or two or three threats that you think security leaders should be paying closer attention to, what would they be?
Great question. So there's a lot of emphasis on, let's call it, the fear of, my data being trained in one of these public models, right? Which is legitimate. So I want to be very clear. I'm certainly not downplaying that as a risk, especially as it relates to, confidential data. And if you've got very, highly proprietary IP, I absolutely understand. But I think a threat that is not emphasized enough, it's emphasized, but I think there needs to be even more emphasis on this, is the threat of that agents represent in the enterprise, right? Recently there was Echo Leak, right? That was a vulnerability. If you think about it, was in the platform, discovered by a third party, and brought to the attention of Microsoft, and Microsoft quickly resolved the issue. But so that's more of a 0-day threat. But, I think as these agents mature and as we move from kind of basic assistance to, well, let's just call it more advanced agents to eventually agentic, I think we're quickly going to be in a space, Alexandra, where we have agents that have high levels of reasoning capabilities. I mean, I would just refer the listeners to the agentic misalignment finding that Anthropic made, which was, we won't go into that, but it's very interesting. That agentic misalignment is just one example of just how remarkable the reasoning capabilities of these of agents are even today, and that's just going to continue to progress. So I think understanding how to what are the proper guardrails for agents, understanding that agents are, we're going beyond just RPA and sophisticated automation to really, hey, we should think about them as digital workers. Perhaps not now, but in the very near future. And we need to think about agents from an ethical perspective, right? From a cultural, from a values perspective, right? Especially as the reasoning capabilities advance. So I think there is just the inherent threat of an agent being compromised, even a simple agent, right? All the way to, as we move closer and closer to agentic with higher levels of reasoning capabilities, you have to think about the technology in a different way. And the guardrails extend beyond data exfiltration. And really you're getting into the realm of, again, ethics, culture, human supervision, which is a dynamic that in many ways hasn't existed in the enterprise. And so now, and so with all of that, it becomes an operating model conversation, right? And not just a technology conversation.
Yeah, it is. We are living in very exciting times when hopefully the reality will be we just think of a certain task and it already gets completed by an AI agent. But at the same time, the question right now that keeps on reappearing is that while they're getting so many new capabilities, they're also getting so many privileges that we weren't quite aware that they're getting them, or what are the implications. And unfortunately, AI agents currently have the security awareness of basically a toddler that is just trying to do their job best, find the quickest path. But going back to your question of ethics, ethics, awareness, this still needs to be caught up. And this is a great example of where still so much needs to mature.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I'd love to, jump into leadership, because a lot of our listeners, they either CISO in a different industry, or they're mid-level and would love to become a CISO one day. So what's your secret to building high-performing teams, especially when you're coming into turnaround situations?
Yeah, so I would say a few things. One, and then so there's kind of the classic advice. So you come in, you quickly assess. Quite often, especially in a turnaround situation, and many times even in a non-turnaround situation, you have to kind of augment the team with new talent from the outside. So that's the traditional answer. And that augmentation sometimes involves restructuring your team and to ensure that it aligns with the business. So we all know that. But one of the things that I think is really critical in building a high-performing team, Alexandra, is, sometimes we come into an organization and there's this newness bias, right? And we can overlook talent that is already there, right? So literally right under your nose. And, that was the case at JustPoint. So we've made changes. We went through a little bit of restructuring, brought in some new talent. But I will tell you that, for example, one of my highest performers is not classically CPG trained and was part of the existing staff in the wrong role. So you got to recognize the capabilities under your nose and make sure you put people, in the right role. And this person has just done an amazing job. I did bring in some folks from the outside, but this was someone who was already in the organization, already had a lot of credibility, a lot of potential, and has done really an amazing job. And so now my focus is on developing this individual and others. There are others within the team that I can mention. But I think that's the key, right? So it's kind of the traditional recommendations mixed with do not lose sight of the fact that there are likely folks already within the four walls of your business who just need a shot, need an opportunity in the right role. And part of that performance and unlocking the performance of your team over time is then investing in that person. Right. And that's what I'm committed to doing. And I think that is, those are kind of the principles that I take into any role.
That's amazing. And I think no matter where leaders go, no matter which positions they take next, it's all about the capability of building other strong leaders underneath that eventually gonna rise to the stars. So it's amazing to see so many great examples, as you mentioned, not overlook people that are already there, and be, I guess, more empathetic and understanding of where they're coming from. Yeah. And you're also involved in venture capital and serve on multiple boards. What are some of the most exciting trends you've seen recently?
I'll mention a few. One is I'm very, very interested in talking with early stage companies who are building models to drive product innovation or to support product innovation. So again, these models don't replace innovation and R&D staff that you may have in-house, but they can be a powerful kind of tool in their toolkit, can improve and accelerate that process of idea generation, in some cases failing fast. And then where you identify a win, accelerating and getting to market. The consumer landscape is increasingly, it's more and more dynamic. And again, it's data rich. And so kind of the natural marriage of these foundation models with consumer behavior is just really exciting. And then another area is all the interesting ways that AI is being leveraged in the security space.
Yeah. Hopefully, all the builders right now are listening closely to what security leaders are excited to see. And, maybe by a wish or magic one, it's all going to come true. And with the speed of innovation today, things come true way faster than we think. So super exciting to see. But overall, is there a specific resource or book that inspires you, whether it's from leadership perspective or from technical standpoint? Because the way you explain today on the podcast, sort of decisions that you made, whether it's about hiring, whether it's about the trends, is there a specific mindset or book that you're paying closer attention to and would advise other people to read?
Yeah, so I'm going to break the rule a little bit if there's a rule. So I'm going to mention two. So one, super quick, Good to Great, Jim Collins. I think it's just from an overall business perspective, it's a classic, but I have to plug that. The other, which I find many people haven't heard of this book. It's unfortunate. So the title of the book, it's The CEO Next Door. And it's based on an interesting, so there's this project, the CEO Genome, where a group of consultants essentially mapped out the genome of successful CEOs. And I happen to think, although I'm a CIO, I think it's helpful for executives to the extent possible, kind of think like a CEO, right? Don't just think from the lens of your function, but think about the enterprise as a whole. Of course, the CEO seat is unique. Again, having that mindset is very helpful. And one of the most impactful chapters, there are many, but one of the most impactful chapters in that book for me personally was this chapter, I think it's titled Engage for Impact, right? And it kind of documented how, a number of successful CEOs, particularly in transformation and turnaround situations, one of the first things they did was really engage deeply with the organization, right? Including the front line, right? Being visible, modeling the values, which you can't do from your office, right? You've got to mix it up and get in the organization, make it easy for folks to reach you, for example. So I think that availability, that empathy, the emphasis on being approachable, and just overall engagement is really, really important. I would say engagement is one of the most important measures. I call it a leading measure of transformation success. So I highly recommend the book, CEO Next Door.
It's amazing. So I'm myself part of a book club, and typically when you go to a book club, they ask you 3 questions about whichever book you decided to read. One is, who do you recommend this book to read? What is the main takeaway? And how did you implement it in your own life? So I think you explained what is the main takeaway, but who would you recommend this book to read and how you ended up implementing in your own life?
I would recommend this book for really anyone in a leadership position. I've recommended it to my direct reports. I don't think you need to be a C-level executive or a CEO. I think there are just a lot of leadership gems within the book. And the way I've deployed it in my life as a leader. So leadership for me is kind of universal. So it's you can apply it at home, in the workplace. And I think just engaging, I tend to be kind of high level. And so it has really encouraged me to adopt a player coach mindset to make sure that I'm making myself available. Sometimes engagement is as simple as spending time with folks. There are times where I've set up meetings, walk and talks where I've had no real agenda, and I've made that clear so as not to create any anxiety, but just spending time with folks, knowing, right? Knowing what's going on in their world, and then ultimately making it clear that you're there. And this is part of servant leadership, which is another thing I'm really passionate about. You're there to help and support them, right? So certainly I'm a work in progress, but it's something that I try to keep front and center every day.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, the better the connection between people, the easier it is to create this communication for companies as well, because the last thing you want is someone not telling you something went wrong. So all of these practices, especially in security, so essential. So I love that. I can imagine how many people would freak out getting a random calendar invite thinking, okay, what have I done wrong? But if it is a consistent practice, I think this is a very great example of how it can be implemented. Chidi, we have this tradition on our podcast where typically our previous guest would ask questions to the next guest. So our last guest asked, beyond IT and security expertise, what other skills do you see as essential on a CISO's team? For instance, teaching or communication skills to help drive awareness and behavior change. So this is just one example. Is there any other skill that you think would be essential?
Emotional intelligence. Sometimes the answer is to important questions are uninteresting and they're not new, right? So we've been talking about emotional intelligence in the technology space for a long time. I think to be fair, I think we've made progress. But I think, yes, having a risk management lens, very important. Communication, very important. But for me, understanding how to navigate complexity across, especially in a large company, a very diverse base of stakeholders. I just think emotional intelligence is the key to navigating the gray effectively. And
it's going to sound as a bit of a controversial question, but do you think EQ beats IQ or IQ beats EQ?
It's actually a great question. I don't have a zero-sum game kind of mindset. I think the two, in order to be really effective, the two need to coexist. There needs to be a healthy amount of, right? Because if you index too far in either direction, you're just not going to be effective. So I don't think the two are in conflict. I think you need a healthy dose of both. So that would be my answer to your question.
Sounds good. What question would you like to ask to our next guest?
Yeah, so we had an interesting discussion here about buy versus build. So I think my answer to that was, something along the lines of it depends. I think there are times where it makes sense to buy and then securely deploy, securely enable. But I also do think that there are times where you do have to build, right? Especially as you're looking to kind of develop an internal capability, right? Which I think capability building is something that we do need to spend a little more time talking about as practitioners. So I guess that would lead to my question for your next guest. Would just love to know their thoughts on how to build an internal AI capability.
Oof, tough one.
Yeah, I know that's a heavy topic, so that's why I kept it generic. Wherever they want to go with that, I'm sure we'll get a good answer.
I feel bad for our next guest. Every time, for some reason, every time the previous guest is just like shoots the next guest, and then they're surprised, and then
it just escalates, right? It just escalates. It's getting out of control.
It doesn't get easier. It doesn't get easier at all. Chidi, I really loved our conversation. We touched upon so many topics. We touched upon, do you buy? Do you build? How do you build your team? How do you transform it? How do you identify the right talent and help them grow? Not necessarily someone who just recently joined in. What the biggest threats out there, whether it is browser related or non-browser related. I think at the end of the day, I guess one theme that keeps on reappearing is whatever new technology appears, there is always a human element attached to it. So it's all about how do we provide the enablement, but at the same time, make sure it's done securely. So many great topics. I love the conversation. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Alexandra. I enjoyed the chat, and I look forward to chatting again in the future.